The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete walls of the small medical clinic in Fallujah as Dr. Sarah Chen finished examining her last patient of the morning. Sweat dripped from her forehead despite the small fan whirring in the corner of the cramped room. She had been working in Iraq for 8 months now, part of a humanitarian medical team, providing care to civilians caught in the crossfire of war. Sarah wiped her hands on a clean towel and glanced at her watch. It was nearly noon, and the heat was becoming unbearable. The clinic, run by an international aid organization, served as one of the few safe havens for injured civilians in the war-torn city. Despite the constant danger, Sarah felt a deep sense of purpose in her work. Every life she saved made the risk worthwhile. "Dr. Chen, we have more patients arriving," called out Amira, the local nurse, who had become Sarah's closest friend and translator. Amira's English was excellent, learned during her university years before the war changed everything. The two women had formed an unlikely but strong bond over their shared dedication to helping others. Sarah nodded and prepared for another wave of injured civilians. The past week had been particularly brutal. With increased fighting in the surrounding neighborhoods, the clinic had seen everything from shrapnel wounds to severe burns, and their medical supplies were running dangerously low. As she organized her instruments, Sarah thought about her family back home in California. Her parents had begged her not to come to Iraq, fearing for her safety, but Sarah felt called to serve where the need was greatest. She had volunteered for this assignment after completing her residency, driven by a desire to use her medical skills to help those who had nowhere else to turn. The afternoon brought a steady stream of patients, mostly women and children seeking treatment for various injuries and illnesses. Sarah worked tirelessly, stitching wounds, setting broken bones, and providing what comfort she could to families torn apart by violence. Amira translated conversations and helped calm frightened children who cried for their parents. Around 4 in the afternoon, a commotion outside caught their attention. Through the small window, Sarah could see a group of armed men approaching the clinic. Her heart rate quickened. They had been warned that insurgents sometimes targeted medical facilities, viewing them as collaborators with foreign forces. "We need to stay calm," Amira whispered, though her voice betrayed her own fear. "Maybe they are just bringing someone who needs help." The men entered the clinic aggressively, shouting in Arabic. Sarah couldn't understand most of what they were saying, but their body language was clearly threatening. One of them, apparently the leader, pointed directly at Sarah and spoke rapidly to Amira. "What are they saying?" Sarah asked quietly, trying to maintain her composure while continuing to tend to a child with a leg wound. Amira's face went pale. "They say you are an American spy. They think the clinic is being used to gather information for the coalition forces." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she continued working. She had always known this was a possibility, but the reality of the situation was terrifying. "Tell them I'm just a doctor. I'm here to help people, not to spy on anyone," Amira translated, but the men became more agitated. They began searching through the clinic's supplies and documents, looking for evidence to support their suspicions. Several patients who had been waiting for treatment quietly slipped out through the back entrance. The leader of the group, a man in his 30s with intense dark eyes, continued questioning Amira about Sarah's activities. He wanted to know who she communicated with, what information she collected about patients, and whether she reported to military personnel. "Doctor, they want you to come with them," Amira said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They say they need to question you properly." Sarah knew that leaving the clinic with these men would likely mean death. Stories of kidnapped aid workers rarely ended well. She looked around the room at the remaining patients, including the child she was treating. How could she abandon them? "I won't leave my patients," Sarah said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "Tell them I have injured people here who need immediate medical attention." The translation only seemed to anger the men further. They began arguing among themselves, some pointing toward the door, others gesturing at Sarah. The tension in the room was suffocating. Suddenly, one of the younger men in the group spoke up, pointing at a woman in the corner who was holding a sick infant. He said something urgently to the leader, who looked over at the mother and child. Amira quickly explained. The young man's sister is here with her baby. The child is very sick, with fever. He's asking the leader to let you treat the baby first. Sarah immediately moved toward the mother and child, grateful for any opportunity to demonstrate her purely medical intentions. The baby was burning with fever and showing signs of severe dehydration. Without immediate treatment, the infant could die within hours. As Sarah began examining the baby, the room fell silent. Even the armed men watched as she worked with gentle precision, checking vital signs and preparing medications. The mother looked up at Sarah with desperate hope in her eyes. The baby needs fluids immediately, Sarah explained to Amira, who translated for the family. Sarah quickly set up an IV line. Her hands steady, despite the circumstances. She had performed this procedure hundreds of times, but never under such intense scrutiny. Over the next hour, Sarah worked tirelessly to stabilize the infant, while the armed men watched. Gradually, the baby's condition improved, and the fever began to break. The mother wept with relief as her child's breathing became easier. The young man, whose nephew Sarah had treated, spoke to the leader with obvious gratitude. There was a long discussion in Arabic, with gestures towards Sarah and the recovering baby. The atmosphere in the room began to shift slightly. However, not all of the men were convinced. The leader remained suspicious, insisting that Sarah's medical work could be a cover for intelligence gathering. He ordered his men to continue searching the clinic for evidence of communication equipment or classified documents. As evening approached, Sarah realized she was in grave danger. The men had found nothing incriminating because there was nothing to find, but their paranoia was growing. They had been at the clinic for hours, and their initial anger was hardening into determination to make an example of the American spy. Amira stayed close to Sarah, translating threats and pleas with equal desperation. Doctor, they are planning to take you away tonight. The leader thinks keeping you here is too risky. Sarah looked around at the clinic that had become her second home. The walls were lined with photographs of patients she had helped, thank you letters from families, and medical certificates she had earned through years of study and dedication. This place represented everything she believed in: healing, compassion, and hope in the face of suffering. If I have to go with them, please make sure the clinic continues to serve patients, Sarah told Amira. Don't let my presence here endanger the mission. As darkness fell over Fallujah, the situation grew more desperate. The men were becoming impatient, and their discussions were growing more heated. Sarah could sense that a decision was approaching, and she feared it would not be in her favor. The young man whose nephew she had saved continued to argue on her behalf, but he was being overruled by others in the group who saw her as a threat to their operations. The clinic, once a place of healing and hope, had become a prison where Sarah awaited an uncertain fate. Outside, the sounds of the city at night provided an ominous soundtrack. Distant explosions, the rumble of military vehicles, and the occasional burst of gunfire. Sarah realized that even if she could escape the clinic, the streets of Fallujah offered little safety for an American woman alone. As she prepared for what might be her final night, Sarah thought about all the patients she had treated and the lives she had touched. Whatever happened next, she knew she had made a difference in this war-torn city. The question now was whether she would survive to continue her work or become another casualty in a conflict that seemed to claim innocent victims with heartbreaking regularity. The armed men settled in for the night, posting guards at the exits and making it clear that Sarah was not free to leave. As she tried to rest on a small cot in the corner of the clinic, surrounded by the medical equipment that defined her purpose, Sarah prepared herself mentally for whatever the next day would bring. She had no way of knowing that her greatest test of survival was still hours away. The first gunshot shattered the morning silence at 6:47 a.m. Sarah jerked awake from her restless sleep on the clinic cot, her heart immediately racing as the unmistakable sound of automatic weapons fire erupted outside. The armed men who had held her captive throughout the night were shouting commands and scrambling for defensive positions. Through the small clinic window, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from nearby buildings. Coalition forces had apparently launched an operation in this sector of Fallujah. and the clinic was caught directly in the middle of the firefight. The insurgents who had spent the night debating her fate were now focused entirely on the battle raging around them. Amira crawled across the floor towards Sarah, keeping low to avoid the bullets that were beginning to shatter the clinic's windows. "The Americans are here," she whispered urgently. "But the fighting is getting worse." The leader of the insurgent group was barking orders, positioning his men at strategic points around the clinic. It became clear that they intended to use the medical facility as a fortress, with Sarah as their hostage. The irony was bitter. The coalition forces fighting to liberate the area might inadvertently cause her death. For the next 2 hours, the battle intensified. Bullets punched through the clinic walls, sending concrete dust raining down on the huddled civilians still trapped inside. Sarah used her medical training to help wounded insurgents and civilians alike, despite the surreal circumstances. A bullet wound was a bullet wound, regardless of who pulled the trigger. One of the insurgents, bleeding from a shoulder wound, initially refused Sarah's help. But as his condition worsened, survival instincts overcame ideology. Sarah worked quickly to stop the bleeding and stabilize him, even as gunfire continued to rage around them. "Why do you help him?" Amira asked, genuinely confused. "These men wanted to kill you." Sarah continued working on the wounded insurgent as she answered, "Because that's what doctors do. We heal people, even our enemies, maybe especially our enemies." The leader watched Sarah treat his wounded comrade with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. For a moment, the rigid lines of conflict blurred as human compassion transcended political divisions. But the moment was brief. Around 9 a.m., the fighting reached a crescendo. Coalition forces had surrounded the building, and the insurgents were running low on ammunition. The leader, realizing his situation was hopeless, made a desperate decision. If he couldn't escape, he would at least deny the enemy their prize. Sarah saw the change in his eyes before she understood what it meant. The man pulled out his sidearm and pointed it directly at her chest. In Arabic, he spoke words that Amira couldn't bring herself to translate immediately. "What did he say?" Sarah asked, though she already knew from his posture that her time was running out. "He says you will not leave here alive. He says your country has brought nothing but death to his people. And now, you will share their fate." The first bullet struck Sarah in the chest, the impact throwing her backward against the medical supply cabinet. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but somehow, she remained conscious. The leader fired again, this time hitting her abdomen, then again and again. As Sarah collapsed to the floor, she could hear Amira screaming. The sound seemed to come from very far away, even though her friend was only a few feet distant. The insurgent continued firing, emptying his clip into Sarah's fallen form. 11 bullets in total, each one finding its mark with devastating precision. The leader left Sarah for dead, turning his attention back to the coalition forces that were closing in on the clinic. Amira rushed to Sarah's side, pressing her hands against the wounds in a futile attempt to stop the massive bleeding. Blood was everywhere, soaking through Sarah's clothes and pooling on the clinic floor. "Stay with me, doctor," Amira whispered urgently. "Help is coming. The Americans are almost here." But Sarah couldn't respond. Her consciousness was fading in and out like a flickering light bulb. She could feel her body going into shock as blood loss and trauma overwhelmed her system. Each breath was a monumental effort, and each heartbeat seemed weaker than the last. The coalition forces breached the clinic 20 minutes later, after the last of the insurgents had either fled or been neutralized. The soldiers, expecting to find enemy combatants, instead discovered a scene of medical chaos. Wounded civilians, destroyed equipment, and in the corner, what appeared to be the lifeless body of an American woman. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, a medic with the 82nd Airborne, was the first to reach Sarah. He quickly assessed her condition and immediately radioed for emergency medical evacuation. Sarah had multiple gunshot wounds to the chest, abdomen, and extremities. By all medical logic, she should have been dead. "I've got a civilian down," Rodriguez spoke into his radio. "American female. Multiple GSWs. Critical condition. Need immediate dust-off. But the situation was complicated. The firefight was still ongoing in adjacent buildings, making helicopter evacuation impossible. The area was simply too hot for medical aircraft to land safely. Sarah would have to be stabilized and transported by ground convoy to the nearest forward operating base. Amira refused to leave Sarah's side, insisting that she could provide valuable medical assistance during the evacuation. Despite regulations against transporting local nationals, the commanding officer recognized that Amira's knowledge of Sarah's condition and her medical training could be crucial. The transport was a nightmare. Every bump in the road, every turn, every sudden acceleration to avoid sniper fire sent waves of agony through Sarah's shattered body. Rodriguez worked frantically to maintain her vital signs, administering IV fluids and emergency medications while the armored vehicle bounced through the war-torn streets of Fallujah. "She's crashing," Rodriguez announced as Sarah's blood pressure dropped to critical levels. "We need to get her to a surgeon now." Rodriguez now. Amira held Sarah's hand throughout the journey, talking to her unconscious friend in both English and Arabic. "You saved so many people, doctor. Now, it's your turn to be saved. Don't give up." The convoy reached the forward operating base after what felt like hours but was actually only 43 minutes. Sarah was immediately rushed into emergency surgery, where a team of military surgeons began the monumental task of repairing the damage from 11 bullet wounds. Dr. James Patterson, the chief surgeon, had seen countless battlefield injuries during his 3 tours in Iraq, but Sarah's case was extraordinary. Not just for the severity of her wounds, but for the simple fact that she was still alive. The bullets had somehow missed her major organs and arteries by millimeters. "I've never seen anything like this," Patterson told his surgical team as they worked. "It's like the bullets followed a path that avoided every vital structure. If any one of these shots had been an inch in either direction, she'd be dead." The surgery lasted 8 hours. Sarah's body had to be opened in multiple locations to remove bullets, repair damaged tissue, and stop internal bleeding. Her left lung had collapsed from a chest wound, requiring emergency decompression. Her liver had been nicked by another bullet, causing significant bleeding that had to be controlled immediately. Meanwhile, word of Sarah's survival was spreading through the base. Soldiers who had heard about the American doctor working in Fallujah were amazed that she had lived through such a brutal attack. Many of them had friends or fellow soldiers who had been saved by medical personnel like Sarah, and they felt a personal connection to her struggle. Amira waited outside the surgical tent for the entire operation, refusing offers of food or rest. Several soldiers attempted to convince her to get some sleep, but she insisted on maintaining her vigil. "The doctor stayed with her patients no matter what," she explained. "I will stay with the doctor." As the hours passed, reports came in from other units operating in Fallujah. The clinic where Sarah had worked for 8 months was completely destroyed, its medical equipment scattered and broken. The photographs on the walls, the thank you letters from grateful families, the symbols of hope and healing, all of it was gone. But the most shocking news came from intelligence reports about the insurgent leader who had shot Sarah. He had been captured alive during the subsequent sweep of the area. Under interrogation, he revealed something that would haunt Sarah when she eventually learned about it. He had ordered her execution not because he believed she was a spy, but because he wanted to send a message to other humanitarian workers operating in Iraq. He said Americans helping Iraqis made his people look weak, the intelligence officer reported. He wanted to scare away the medical teams so more Iraqis would die and blame the coalition forces. When Dr. Patterson finally emerged from the surgical tent, his scrubs were stained with blood and his face was etched with exhaustion. Amira rushed to meet him, desperate for news about her friend's condition. "She's alive," Patterson said simply. "I don't know how, but she's alive. We've removed 10 of the 11 bullets. 1 is lodged near her spine, too dangerous to extract right now. She's lost a tremendous amount of blood, and the next 48 hours will be critical." Amira wept with relief, but Patterson's expression remained grave. "I have to be honest with you. Even though she survived the surgery, her chances are still very poor. The trauma to her body has been enormous. Her organs are shutting down from the shock, and infection is a major risk. Sarah was moved to the intensive care unit, where she remained unconscious and connected to multiple life support machines. Her breathing was assisted by a ventilator, her blood pressure maintained by powerful medications, and her kidney function supported by continuous dialysis. Every bodily system was struggling to recover from the devastating assault. For the next day and night, Sarah hovered between life and death. Her vital signs fluctuated wildly, sometimes improving enough to give hope, other times dropping so low that medical personnel prepared for the worst. Amira never left her bedside, holding her hand and continuing to speak to her unconscious friend. The medical team was baffled by Sarah's resilience. By all conventional medical wisdom, her injuries should have been fatal. The combination of blood loss, organ trauma, and shock typically resulted in death within the first few hours. Yet Sarah continued to fight, her body somehow finding the strength to heal itself against impossible odds. On the second morning, something remarkable happened. Sarah's eyelids fluttered briefly, just for a moment, but enough for the nurses to notice. Her brain activity, which had been minimal during her coma, began to show signs of improvement. The doctors cautiously adjusted her medications, hoping to encourage her journey back to consciousness. That afternoon, as Amira sat beside the bed reading aloud from a medical journal they had shared back at the clinic, Sarah's fingers moved slightly. It was barely perceptible, but Amira felt it immediately. "Doctor, can you hear me?" But Sarah remained unconscious, her body still fighting a battle for survival that was far from over. Outside the medical tent, preparations were being made for a special operation that would soon determine whether Sarah's incredible will to live would be enough to see her through to recovery. Lieutenant Commander Jake "Hawk" Morrison received the mission briefing at 0400 hours on the third day after Sarah's shooting. His SEAL team had been tasked with what appeared to be a routine intelligence gathering operation in the same sector of Fallujah where the clinic attack had occurred. However, the mission took on personal significance when Morrison learned about the American doctor who had been left for dead. Morrison had lost his younger sister in the September 11th attacks. She had been working as a nurse in one of the towers, helping injured people evacuate when the building collapsed. The parallel between his sister's dedication to healing and Sarah's humanitarian work in Iraq was not lost on him. Intel suggests there might be more American civilians being held in the area. Morrison's commanding officer briefed the team. "We're going in to search for any evidence of kidnapped aid workers or medical personnel. Secondary objective is to gather intelligence on insurgent operations in that sector." What Morrison didn't know was that military intelligence had received a tip from a local informant about an American woman who might still be alive somewhere in the ruins of the medical district. The informant's information was sketchy and unconfirmed, but it was enough to justify a reconnaissance mission. Morrison's 6-man team inserted into Fallujah under cover of darkness, using night vision equipment to navigate the bombed-out streets. The area around the destroyed clinic was eerily quiet, with most residents having fled during the recent fighting. Abandoned buildings stood like broken teeth against the starlit sky. The team methodically searched building after building, looking for any signs of insurgent activity or imprisoned civilians. They found evidence of recent occupation in several structures: sleeping mats, food containers, ammunition caches, but no people. The insurgents had apparently retreated deeper into the city after the clinic battle. It was Master Chief Petty Officer Tom Bulldog Stevens who first noticed something unusual in the rubble of a partially collapsed building adjacent to the clinic. Using his night vision scope, he spotted what appeared to be fresh tire tracks, leading to a basement entrance that had been hastily concealed with debris. "Hawk, you need to see this," Stevens whispered into his radio. "Got what looks like a hidden entrance about 50 meters from the clinic site." Morrison moved his team into position around the concealed entrance. Using hand signals, he directed 2 men to clear the debris, while the others provided security. What they discovered beneath the rubble was a narrow staircase leading to an underground storage area that the insurgents had converted into a makeshift prison. The basement was empty when the SEALs cleared it, but evidence suggested it had been recently occupied. There were chains mounted to the walls, empty food containers, and most tellingly, medical supplies that appeared to have been looted from the clinic above. But there was something else that caught Morrison's attention. Drops of blood leading from the basement to another concealed exit at the far end of the underground chamber. These bloodstains are recent, Stevens observed, examining the trail with his flashlight. Maybe 12 to 18 hours old. The blood trail led the SEALs through a network of underground tunnels that connected several buildings in the area. The insurgents had apparently used this hidden passage system to move between positions without being detected by coalition forces. The Americans followed the tunnels for nearly half a mile before emerging in the basement of a seemingly abandoned apartment building. As they ascended to the ground floor, Morrison heard something that made him freeze. The faint sound of labored breathing, coming from somewhere above. Using hand signals, he positioned his team to clear the building floor by floor, following the sound that grew slightly stronger as they climbed. On the third floor, in a small room at the end of a darkened hallway, they found her. Sarah was barely recognizable. She lay on a filthy mattress, her body racked with fever and infection. The insurgents had apparently moved her from the clinic after the battle, intending to use her as a bargaining chip. But when their position became untenable, they had simply abandoned her to die slowly in this hidden location. "Dear God," whispered Stevens, as he knelt beside Sarah's motionless form. "How is she still alive?" Morrison quickly checked for vital signs while Stevens radioed for immediate medical evacuation. Sarah's pulse was weak and irregular, her breathing shallow and labored. The wounds from the 11 gunshots had become infected during her abandonment, and she was clearly suffering from severe dehydration and sepsis. "This is Bulldog. We need immediate dust-off. American civilian, female, critical condition," Stevens spoke into his radio. "Multiple gunshot wounds. Signs of infection and dehydration. She's been missing for approximately 48 hours. Sarah's eyes flickered open briefly as Morrison examined her wounds. For just a moment, her gaze focused on his face with a clarity that was startling given her condition. She tried to speak, but no sound emerged from her parched throat. "Don't try to talk," Morrison said gently. "You're safe now. We're Americans, and we're going to get you out of here." The SEAL medic, Petty Officer First Class Carlos Rodriguez, began emergency treatment while the team secured the building. Rodriguez had seen plenty of battlefield injuries, but Sarah's condition was extraordinary. Not only had she survived 11 gunshot wounds, but she had also endured nearly 2 days without medical attention in unsanitary conditions. "Her body temperature is 104 degrees, Rodriguez reported. "Severe dehydration, multiple infected wounds, possible septic shock. I'm amazed she's still conscious at all." As Rodriguez worked to stabilize Sarah, Morrison discovered evidence of her captivity in the room. Water containers that had been deliberately placed just out of her reach. Medical supplies that could have treated her infections but had been withheld, and photographs of her injuries that the insurgents had apparently planned to use for propaganda purposes. "These bastards were going to let her die slowly," Stevens observed grimly. "They kept her alive just long enough to document her suffering." The helicopter evacuation team faced significant challenges reaching the location. The apartment building was surrounded by other structures, making a rooftop landing impossible. Instead, the SEALs had to carry Sarah to a small courtyard several blocks away, all while maintaining security in hostile territory. The journey through the dark streets was harrowing. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally muttering words that Rodriguez recognized as medical terminology. Even in her delirium, her mind was focused on healing and helping others. "She keeps talking about patience," Rodriguez told Morrison as they moved through an alley. "Says something about a baby with fever. Needs to check on surgical supplies. This lady's a real doctor, boss." Rodriguez. When they finally reached the evacuation point, Sarah was immediately loaded onto the medical helicopter and rushed to the main coalition hospital in Baghdad. Morrison and his team watched the aircraft disappear into the night sky, wondering if they had found her too late to make a difference. The medical team in Baghdad was shocked by Sarah's condition when she arrived. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the chief of emergency medicine, had been briefed about the rescue, but was unprepared for the reality of Sarah's injuries and the fact that she had survived so long without proper medical care. "This woman should have died 3 days ago," Dr. Harper told her staff as they began emergency treatment. "The fact that she's still fighting is nothing short of miraculous." Sarah underwent another extensive surgery to clean her infected wounds and repair damage that had worsened during her captivity. The medical team discovered that one of the bullets had actually been slowly working its way toward her heart, held back only by scar tissue that had formed around it. During the surgery, Sarah's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her blood pressure dropped to critical levels, and her heart stopped beating for 43 seconds. The surgical team performed emergency resuscitation, and somehow, impossibly, Sarah's heart began beating again. "I've been practicing medicine for 20 years, doctor," Harper said after the surgery. "I've never seen anyone fight this hard to stay alive. It's like her will to live is stronger than the medical realities of her injuries." Recovery was slow and painful. Sarah remained in a medically induced coma for 8 days, while her body fought against infection and began the long process of healing. Amira had been flown to Baghdad to be with her friend, and she maintained her bedside vigil with the same dedication she had shown at the forward operating base. When Sarah finally regained consciousness, her first words were a question about her patients back at the clinic. Despite everything she had endured, her primary concern was still for the people she had been trying to help. "The clinic?" she whispered to Amira through cracked lips. Amira struggled with how to tell her friend that the medical facility had been destroyed. "It's gone, doctor. But the patients remember what you did for them." Word is spreading throughout Fallujah about the American doctor who risked everything to help Iraqi families. Over the following weeks, Sarah learned the full extent of her ordeal. She discovered that her survival had become something of a legend among both coalition forces and local civilians. The insurgent who had shot her was being held for war crimes, and intelligence gathered from his interrogation had led to the capture of an entire terrorist cell. Morrison and his SEAL team visited Sarah during her recovery. The tough special operations soldiers were visibly moved by meeting the woman they had pulled back from the brink of death. Morrison told Sarah about his sister and how finding Sarah alive had given him a sense of purpose beyond military objectives. "You remind me why we're here," Morrison told her. "It's not just about fighting. It's about protecting people like you who are trying to make the world better." Sarah's recovery was remarkable, though not without complications. She would need multiple additional surgeries to fully repair the damage from her gunshot wounds, and the bullet near her spine would remain there permanently, too dangerous to remove. She would walk with a slight limp for the rest of her life, and chronic pain would be her constant companion. But none of that mattered to Sarah. As soon as she was medically stable, she began planning her return to humanitarian work. The experience had not broken her spirit. Instead, it had strengthened her resolve to continue helping people in crisis situations around the world. 6 months later, Sarah was back in the field, this time working with refugee populations in Syria. She carried with her a small piece of shrapnel that doctors had removed from her shoulder, a reminder of her time in Fallujah and the incredible chain of events that had saved her life. Amira joined Sarah in her new assignment, having been granted special status to work with international humanitarian organizations. The bond forged between the two women during those terrible days in Fallujah had created a partnership that would last for years to come. Sarah never forgot the lessons learned during her 48 hours of hell in Fallujah. She had discovered depths of human resilience she never knew existed, both in herself and in the people who had risked everything to save her. The experience taught her that survival often depends not just on medical treatment or military rescue, but on the simple human refusal to give up hope. Years later, when Sarah would speak at medical conferences about trauma surgery and survival psychology, she would always conclude with the same message: the human spirit is capable of enduring far more than we think possible. Sometimes the difference between life and death isn't just medicine or luck. It's the decision to keep fighting when every logical reason tells you to quit. The story of Dr. Sarah Chen became part of military and medical folklore, a testament to the power of human determination and the importance of never abandoning hope, even in the darkest circumstances. Her survival against impossible odds inspired countless others to continue their own fights against adversity, proving that sometimes miracles do happen to those who refuse to surrender.